Welcome to Cantini. My name is Paul Herbert. I'm the director of the 1st Division Museum, which is about 500 yards that way. And we're delighted to see you tonight. I've been making the rounds here, and I think just about every person here has been here before, but in the event that you have not, Cantini is the historic home of the late Colonel Robert R. McCormick, who lived here, was owner, editor, and publisher of the Chicago Tribune, powerful and handsome man, and had a great career, multimillionaire, lived in his home is about 500 yards that way, died here, is buried here, and second only to the Chicago Tribune in the Colonel's heart was the 1st Division of the U.S. Army, in which he served in World War I as a citizen soldier, and he never forgot his comrades in arms. He was devoted to veterans and service members for the rest of his life, often rallied the American Legion here on the grounds. And when he passed away, he left Cantini, which he named after a little village in France where America fought its first battle in World War I. He named this place Cantini to honor that battle. And when he passed away, he said, turn Cantini into a public park for the people of Illinois, and don't forget about my beloved 1st Division. And so that's why you have a 1st Division museum here on Cantini Park, and we're delighted to have you here. We had a speaker that you probably really would like to hear all lined up for tonight, but at the last minute she had a personal emergency and couldn't come, and they threw me in, and this is what you get. So that's why we let you drink for an hour before before we start. So I don't have to introduce the speaker because I'm the speaker. I did have to take him to dinner, and the conversation was kind of dull, but we made do, and now we're here. So I'm going to talk about Operation Iraqi Freedom, and the BRO, B-R-O, is the Big Red One. Okay, sort of a jargon term for the 1st Infantry Division, and I'll talk about it from the perspective of the 1st Division. And there's a couple of disclaimers before we get started. I'm not here to justify the war in Iraq, and I'm not here to criticize the war in Iraq. I'm here to talk about the war in Iraq and some of the things that we know, because our job is to follow the history of the 1st Infantry Division. And that doesn't mean the past history entirely, it means the contemporary history. And so we've tried as hard as I know how to keep up with that history over the last 10 or 15 years that our military has been deployed around the world, dealing with all the problems that we know they're dealing with. And someday we're going to create new galleries in the museum to tell the story since the war in Vietnam. And so this is part of the work that we do to make sure that we're smart about it. I'm not an expert on the Middle East. I'm not an expert on Islam. I'm not an expert on terrorism. I'm not an expert on a whole lot of things, but I'm going to do my best to talk about that conflict based on the history of the 1st Division. So what I thought we'd do first, though, is take a look at a real little clip here that was not put together by me. It was put together by a group of soldiers, 1st Infantry Division soldiers, served in Iraq, came home, and made a little video out of their service there. So if we'd play that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I heard it was like. Yeah, remember that one? That one took out like 30 people, fucked up like 4 cars. Fucking guts laying there.
Stronghold, and it's surrounded by Shia areas. Now,
So a lot of the stuff that I'll talk about the rest of the evening is kind of higher level, policy level stuff. But we don't want to, I thought that captured pretty well what soldiers saw and what they thought was important to record. And there's a little bit of rough language in there, but all of us who serve know that soldiers can use rough language from time to time, and often they have good reason for doing it. And so with all of this business about why we went to Iraq and how we served in the war, every single day that we're making, or that our government is making policy decisions, some GI is in places like that doing the job that we asked them to do. So if I can find my device here, and if it works. So here's what we're going to talk about. First, why do we go? And then I'll talk a little bit about the 1st Infantry Division in the early year of the war, after the invasion. Talk about the enemy. Talk about the deployment of Task Force Danger. The last time that the entire 1st Infantry Division deployed to combat was in 2004 and 2005, when it left Germany and went to Iraq and served there for a year as a division, and they called it Task Force Danger. We'll talk very briefly about MITs, military transition teams. We'll talk about the surge. We'll talk about fighting and ending a long war and then resuming that long war. When we're done here, I'll be happy to answer questions if anybody's got any. I think first of all, we ought to look at Iraq from 1991, the end of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War, until 2001 when 9/11 occurred. And most of you remember that there was what the Air Force called an aerial occupation of Iraq. But what it meant was that there were 2 no-fly zones, a southern no-fly zone and a northern no-fly zone. And we ran 2 operations, Operation Southern Watch and Operation Northern Watch. And what we said to Saddam Hussein after defeating him in the Persian Gulf War in Operation Desert Storm is, you can't fly any military aircraft over those 2 areas. The southern zone is largely Shia. Of course, Saddam Hussein comes from a Sunni tribe of Iraq. And the northern area is largely Kurdish. Those were the 2 parts of the Iraqi population that had rebelled against Saddam Hussein at the end of Desert Storm, and which he had brutally repressed, and we didn't want to see any resumption of that. And so this was a way of containing the Saddam Hussein regime after we had chased them out of Kuwait in Desert Storm. And we did that for 10 years relatively successfully. Most of the aerial operations in the south came out of carriers in the Gulf, and also air bases in the Gulf states. And in Operation Northern Watch, for the most part, they flew out of bases in Turkey. And of course, Turkey is a NATO ally. I think it's important for a second to take a look at the demography of Iraq. And I'm not an expert at all on this. So, but I found this handy-dandy chart, which makes me look like an expert. And you have at least 3 main divisions of the population of Iraq. The first and most prominent is a religious division between Shia Muslims and Sunni Muslims. We won't get into the theological and faith differences between those 2 groups. Just say that they're both Muslim, they're very different, and they've kind of been at each other's throats about their differences for a very long time. So all this green area here is Shia Iraq for the most part, and in the north and the west it's Sunni Iraq. The next big division is ethnic, and you have Arabs and you have Kurds. You might have a Shia Arab, you might have a Sunni Arab, you might have a Sunni Kurd, you could have a Shia Kurd. I don't know that there's a lot of those. There are also various ethnic groups that come out of Iran that are more Persian than Arab, and they're mixed in there as well. And then the third big slice of the population of Iraq is by tribe. They're a very tribal society, and so all these names like al-Tikriti and al-Baghdadi and all so on and so forth and so forth, what it means is where you are from, okay? And it designates your tribe, and so the tribe of which you're a part is a very, very, very important part of who you are in the society of Iraq. So you can take those three variables, tribe, religion, ethnicity, and you can mix up the demography of Iraq like a Rubik's Cube. And indeed, in many places, it's very, very intermixed. These are ancient peoples. They're ancient faiths in many cases. They have lived for millennia without cutting each other's throats, but they have also been at each other's throats for a variety of reasons for thousands of years. We often talk about the Sunni triangle, and it's not really a triangle, but it's roughly right there. Baghdad is there. This is Al-Anbar province, which is almost entirely Sunni, as you can see on this map right here, and it goes north to Tikrit, where you start to get into the Kurdish area of Iraq. Tikrit is the city that Saddam Hussein was from and where his tribe is. And so that area, the Sunni triangle, this is a U.S. term, I believe, but it designates kind of the center of gravity of the Sunni population of Iraq and the Sunni resistance to the U.S. and coalition efforts through much of the war in Iraq. So having some sense of how mixed up it is really crucial to understanding what happens. Of course, the road to war begins the attack of September 11th, 2001 on the United States, and that changed everything since and how we look at security. And of course, we didn't go after the Iraqis initially. We went after the Afghans, and we went after the Taliban. And so you can see kind of the important milestones here, and I'll give you a second just to absorb that. And I think everybody kind of remembers all of those events. There's a couple of points that I want to make about that chronology, though, that will come, that I think will be important in just a second. And that is that in March of 2002, our military operations in Afghanistan appeared to be highly successful. The Taliban were chased out. The Taliban government had collapsed. They were chased out of Afghanistan and had crossed the border into Pakistan, where they found safe haven in the federal tribal regions of western Pakistan. The Northern Alliance had triumphed in the long simmering civil war. We had chased remnants of Al-Qaeda out of Iraq or out of Afghanistan, and in fact, some of the major players in Al-Qaeda escaped to Iraq, across northern Iran and into Iraq. So when President Bush made his address in September of 2002 to the United Nations about the Iraqi WMD threat, weapons of mass destruction, we thought we had pretty much a handle on Afghanistan, and that was going pretty well. And then there was all this business of, will the Iraqis comply or not comply with the UN inspections on WMD, and Secretary Powell's testimony to the United Nations to the effect that not only have they not complied, but they are deliberately concealing a weapons of mass destruction capability, and that's why we have to invade. And so the president issued an ultimatum, gave the Saddam Hussein regime 48 hours to clear out of Iraq. When they didn't do that, he initiated the invasion of Iraq. These are the war aims that President Bush articulated in an address to the nation in 2003. You can agree with them or not agree with them. We could talk forever on where they actually came from. But when we were on the threshold of war, the elected president of the United States said, this is why we're going to war. And I'll give you a few minutes to sort of absorb those. There's a couple of points that I would call to your attention. The first is, I think it's pretty clear that in the president's mind, he associates the threat that he sees in Iraq with 9/11. It is true that the president and the Republican administration had been interested in changing the status quo in Iraq ever since they were elected to office. We had been there 10 years with Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch. And I can remember I was still on active duty in the 1990s and in the Pentagon in the late 1990s, and there was all kinds of discussion, particularly among our Air Force and Navy colleagues, about how long are we going to do this? Is this going to be like Korea? We're going to do Operation Northern Watch and Southern Watch for the next 50 years, 75 years? You know, what's the end state? So there was some of that discussion. But after 9/11, the urgency of situations like Iraq was raised astronomically high. And in the Bush administration's mind, if a terrorist could attack with jetliners, New York and Washington, then what if they had a weapon of mass destruction? And who might give them a weapon of mass destruction? And can we afford to wait until a terrorist gets hold of a weapon of mass destruction and delivers it against the United States? So all of that was sort of in the minds of the president and the administration. You can see it in this, in the language that he uses here. There's another thing that's behind this language, and that is a neoconservative worldview of strategy and warfare. Now, what do I mean by that? When the Bush administration was elected, and when they came to power, there were many very high officials in the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and elsewhere who believed two things about the use of American power in the world. And you can agree or not agree with this, but we elected them, and this was our worldview. And oversimplified and summarized. But the first was that if the United States uses its power to remove tyrants and free people who are under tyranny, then people will rise to the opportunity to be free, and in fairly short order will create democratic institutions of some kind and move more toward a democratic form of government and become friendly to the West and to the United States. So that's one piece of that's one worldview. Another worldview, and this was particularly in Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, is the perception that American military power is particularly advantageous over our enemies in a technological sense. And we should move from trying to overwhelm our enemies with superior numbers and boots on the ground to all our whiz-bang technological advantages. And they saw in the war on Afghanistan, where we went in with a very light footprint on the ground, mostly special forces. And you remember the pictures of the special forces guys riding horses and holding a computer with which they're talking to orbiting aircraft overhead that can launch a precision-guided munition and land it square in the lap of a terrorist that we've been able to pinpoint with a laser. That really did work in Afghanistan. The introduction of American Special Forces and precision-guided munitions allowed the Northern Alliance to overwhelm the Taliban in a matter of days after they'd been fighting with each other for years. So another part of the neoconservative worldview is that America should capitalize on its technological superiority to win military conflicts overseas and move away from mobilizing large numbers of soldiers and putting a huge footprint on the ground. So this is what the president says. I think there are 4 phases, and this is Herbert, not any other historian. There are 4 phases to the war in Iraq, and the rest of my talk, I'm going to talk about these 4 phases, okay? The first is from 2003 to 2005. We go into Iraq and we topple the Saddam Hussein regime pretty quickly. And the worldview of the president and the administration is those 2 things that I just talked about. With him and his regime gone, well-meaning people who are now free will pretty quickly start to develop democratic forms of government. And the second thing is that it's our technological superiority that has created the military victory, light footprint on the ground. We can pretty quickly start to pull that back out and allow the host nation, in this case the Iraqis, to form their own government and provide for their own security without a great deal of American occupation or assistance. That belief is what we are trying to do from 2005 or from 2003 into 2005 in the first phase of the war. By 2006, that's going badly. And people are getting tired and the casualties are going up. And so between 2005 and 2007, you have a struggle in Washington over what are we really going to do? Are we going to continue down this path and just throw more military forces at it and hope that it works out? Are we going to pull back? Are we going to pull out and just let the whole thing collapse? What are we going to do? And that issue is resolved in a thing that we call the surge. And I'll talk about the surge in a few minutes. It happens in 2007, and the surge is a reverse engines. We're not pulling out, we're going in. We are sending more troops, thousands, tens of thousands more troops into Iraq. And we're going to change the strategy, and we're going to get hold of the violence, and we're going to create the conditions under which American troops can be withdrawn. So from 2007 to 2008, that's what we're doing. 2008, Barack Obama is elected president. And he believes that he is elected on a mandate to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so from his election on, he announces in February 2009, we're going to stay there 1 more year, and then a year to pull out, and it's over. We're bringing the troops home. And so for that period, we're talking about occupation and withdrawal, trying to control the violence and get the Americans out, because that's the policy of the United States. Okay, so those are the 4 phases. This is the invasion. General Tommy Franks was the Commander-in-Chief, United States Central Command, meaning he's the 4-star guy who's got this problem, saddled with this problem, and he leads the invasion of Iraq. And the invasion is a very light footprint. It is a single division of the United States Army, the 3rd U.S. Infantry Division, okay, and a division-size equivalent of the United States Marine Corps. And they go right up the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley, brushing aside most significant resistance pretty quickly. They get into Baghdad. Baghdad's a little stickier, but in fairly short order, they topple. Saddam gets away, but his regime doesn't, and we're in. Now, what we had planned to do also is invade through Turkey with the 4th Infantry Division. And at the very last minute, the Turks, our NATO allies, said, no soap, we can't do this. Now, you can be upset. They're a NATO ally. Why would they not allow us to do this? But the other thing, you can look at it from their point of view. Okay, they live in this neighborhood. And so they got to play their cards pretty doggone carefully. So what we did is we did a parachute assault with the 173rd Airborne Brigade. We flew right over Turkey and dropped paratroopers in, several thousand of them. J.D. Kamas back here was not a paratrooper, but he was a guy in a tank in the 1st Battalion, 63rd Armor Regiment. of the 1st Infantry Division that was attached to the 173rd and went in as kind of the heavy muscle behind all of those paratroopers. And there's the Sunni triangle that I was talking about just a second ago. These are the guys who are calling the shots. General Franks, as soon as the Saddam regime falls, General Franks is moved aside, and General John Abizaid becomes Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Central Command. John Abizaid is a guy that I know well, former commanding general of the 1st Infantry Division. So he's got the con in the Middle East. He works directly for the Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, and we decide we need a 4-star officer in charge of Iraq. The Central Command guy has the whole Middle East. So even though Iraq is the biggest show in his area, he's got a lot of other responsibilities. We need a 4-star on the ground in Iraq, and that guy is George Casey. Now there's a lot of other players. There's Condoleezza Rice, and there's Colin Powell, and there's just all kinds of players. But this is essentially the military chain of command, and of course the strategy is being driven by the President and the Secretary of Defense, and they are of the worldview that I expressed just a minute ago. And now this chart, very busy, shows you what the 1st Infantry Division did across those 4 phases of the war. The first phase, the invasion and liberation, is in blue. The second phase, what are we really doing, is in green. The 4th phase, the surge, is in brown. And finally, the stabilize the place and get out is in black. Don't worry about all these acronyms in here. Those are military acronyms that just designate which part of the 1st Division was going. We don't have to concern ourselves with that so much tonight. But let me point out a couple of things. First of all, from March of 2003 until October of 2011, somebody in the 1st Infantry Division is either going to or coming home from Iraq, almost continuously. And what's not on my chart is the 5 deployments that same division supported to Afghanistan in those same years. And what's not on that chart are the hundreds of soldiers who went to Iraq as military transition teams, which I'll talk about in a second. And what's not on that chart is all the little nickel-dime deployments, like you need an EOD team, or you need an engineer platoon, or you need a chemical warfare outfit, or you need some medical specialists, or you need some intelligence specialists, and you task a division. Now, the 1st Division is not the only division, so everybody in the Army is being so tasked, but when we talk about op-tempo, the operational tempo of the Army, it is very high for these soldiers. They are coming and going. Okay, let's take one example of that. Let's take the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Infantry Division. And it pops up right here before the surge, August 2006 to November 2007. It's in Iraq. And in November 2007, it comes home, and 1 year later, October 2008, it goes to Iraq. Comes home in November 2009, find it again. November 2010, off it goes, stays to October 2011. 1 year over, 1 year back. 1 year over, 1 year back. 1 year over, 1 year back. I know of a 1st Infantry Division sergeant who, on his halfway through his 3rd deployment, he self-identified as a mental health casualty and requested evacuation. He couldn't take it anymore. When he got home, he was racked with guilt because he left his buddies, and he was a sergeant. But what he said was, I knew I couldn't go outside the wire one more day with those men's lives in my hands. I had reached the point where I could do no more. And I knew it, and I was going to get somebody killed. And he'll live with the guilt of that for the rest of his life. When you add up the days of his deployments, 2.5 deployments, and this is, the 1st deployment, he's a private. 2nd, he's a buck sergeant. 3rd, he's a staff sergeant. Okay? When you add up those days, he had more time, so he's always outside the wire. This is not a guy in some administrative headquarters, typing out forms or something like that. And God bless all the people who have ever done that. We need it done. But he was not this guy was at the pointy end of the spear. He was outside the wire every day looking for bad guys. And when you add up the days of his deployments, he had more accumulated time in combat than the 1st Infantry Division had in World War II from the time it landed in North Africa in November 1942 to VE Day in May of 1945. So it's real easy to look at this generation of soldiers and say, well, they never fought any big battles. There was never any Omaha Beach or Battle of the Bulge. No, there wasn't. The character of war has changed dramatically. But this was tough lifestyle on these young men and some women who have served us so well in the last little while. Okay, so the point of that is the 1st Division is coming and going out of Fort Riley, Kansas, like a house of fire. And they are not atypical. All of our active units are doing a similar thing. And our Guard and Reserve are not quite this pace, but we're sending plenty of them. The first rotation is the 1st Brigade in OIF 2, which is after the initial invasion. It's there from 2003, 2004. This is a picture of Buck Connor, the colonel who commanded that brigade. They're right here, just there's Fallujah that I know you've heard of. There's Al-Ramadi that I'll show you a picture of in a second. Baghdad is right here. This whole area of operations is under Marine responsibility, so they're attached to the 1st MEF, Marine Expeditionary Force, and then they give up some of their Army units to work with Marine units, and they gain some Marine units that work with them. So it's a mixed Army-Marine force. And they do a lot of stuff in there, particularly in a place called Fallujah that I know you've all heard about. This is just one little part of what Al-Ramadi, Iraq looks like. Okay, so this is the kind of terrain that these soldiers are in. Another thing about, and we'll see a map of this later on, but for any of you who've been to Iraq, it's almost entirely desert. And it's hotter than the hinges of Hades on any given day, okay? Most of the population is along the river valleys, the Tigris and the Euphrates, from Basra on the head of the Persian Gulf up to Baghdad, and then the 2 rivers branch out. This is Mesopotamia. This is the, come on, somebody help me. The cradle of civilization, the Fertile Crescent. There's the word that I'm looking for. Thank you very much. That's exactly what it is. It's a Fertile Crescent. Everybody today lives close to those rivers, just as they did 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. The rest of it is desert. So that's where the population centers are. You can see the Euphrates River running right there, and this is the city. One of the things, I could tell you a lot that happened in that first rotation, but one thing that happened as an expedient that has been happening ever since are these, the Lionesses, female engagement teams. Now, in 2003 and 2004, women were excluded from combat positions. They could be in combat units, but they couldn't have a specialty that required them to close with and destroy the enemy, which is infantry and armor and artillery. And so those are the rules. But in dealing in a war with the population, you have to deal with civilian women, with native women. And a taboo in all Islamic societies is for strange men to have physical contact with women. You just don't do that. You don't shake hands with them, you don't touch them, you just don't do that. So what the American Army found out was, if you're going to prevent women from smuggling things through your checkpoints, you've got to search them, and that better not be a guy. So we went to all these service units, and we said, would any of you young women like to volunteer to go out with the infantry and do what they do in order to be on hand for when they encounter women, so that you can search the women, you can segregate the women, you can calm women down, you can show them that you are also a woman. Well, hundreds of these women volunteered. And they get a real quick orientation. And, okay, now you're going to be an infantry person 3 days, right? And off you go. And they performed very, very, very well. There was a wonderful documentary done in 2008 called Lioness. We had it screened here. Some of you may remember at the 1st Division Museum. because the first women who did that were out of the 1st Engineer Battalion of the 1st Infantry Division. It was an innovation of the 1st Division. Now it's done all the time. As a matter of fact, this picture here is not in Iraq. This picture is from Afghanistan, but you can see there are several 1st Division women here wearing the hijab, I think it's called, the traditional Muslim scarf, and meeting with a group of Afghan women. So who's the enemy? Well, almost everybody. Because when we toppled the Saddam Hussein regime, we uncorked a struggle for power among all these different groups that I talked about just a second ago. Saddam kept control of Iraq because he was a brutal dictator. He was Sunni. The Sunnis are a minority. And so he ran a police state in the greatest traditions of Joseph Stalin and Adolf Hitler. He had a secret police. He ran the courts. He outlawed a free press. There is no criticism. There's one political party, the Ba'ath Party. That's how he controlled Iraq. There were a lot of people in Iraq who had a lot against the Sunnis, the Baathists, the Tikritis, because of the legacy of Saddam Hussein. But there are a lot of other people around there that have grievances and blood debts against each other and who want to have power in the regime that succeeds Saddam Hussein. And oh, by the way, they weren't brought up since grade school on Jeffersonian democracy. So the way that they're going to get power in the post-Saddam regime is to acquire it by demonstrating themselves to be the most powerful tribe. One of the most dangerous of these is Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, is the de facto leader, sort of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And these are Sunni Islamic extremists who have bought into a very rigid, very narrow interpretation of Islam. And in its name, they want to chase out of the holy lands of the Middle East the Crusaders. The Crusaders are us and our desire for oil, principally, but our presence in the Middle East, in the Holy Lands. And that's their line. And they justify, given that line, almost any form of violence against the United States and its manifestations, and they justify almost any form of violence against people who don't agree with them. Now, this guy was in Afghanistan in 2001. And he was one of the guys who got out of Afghanistan and into Iraq before we invaded Iraq. So people can say, well, there was no connection between Iraq and the terrorists who actually launched 9/11. And we could argue this. There's a stack of evidence on either side. But the fact of the matter is that some Al-Qaeda extremists, extremely bad guys, got out of Afghanistan after we toppled the Taliban regime and got into Iraq. And that was part of the equation as the Bush administration looked at, is it possible that a group like Al-Qaeda that attacked us on 9/11 could get their mitts on weapons of mass destruction and somehow use those to attack the United States, either overseas or here at home. So Zarqawi, and we got him. He was killed in an American precision airstrike in 2006. So the nature of the way that we're using these weapons is completely different. We're looking for pinpoint targets that are dependent on a huge amount of intelligence about exactly who is in that house. What room of that house are they in? Are they there right now? Who is with them? Is that person a legitimate target or not? Is that a non-combatant? Oh, blah, 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 and a whole bunch of other stuff too. And then finally somebody says, yeah, launch the strike. So we got Zarqawi. But Al-Qaeda in Iraq, we did not get. And it was in the Sunni triangle, and it is among the most lethal groups that are trying to create trouble in Iraq. The Mahdi Army, it's Shia. It's in the northeastern neighborhood of Baghdad. It is a Shia militia. It is also extremist. It is also both extreme in its religious beliefs, its political beliefs, and it has its own armed militia. And they are also struggling for power. Then you have sectarian and tribal militias of all kinds. Plus you've got Arab nationalists. You've got the Baathists. In 2003, we disbanded the Baath Party, and we said, if you remember the Baath Party, you can't have a job anymore. Well, just like in communist Soviet Union or Nazi Germany, and not everybody in Nazi Germany was a bad person, but if you wanted to do anything, you had to be a member of the Nazi Party. In Iraq, if you wanted to do anything significant, you had to be a member of the Baathist Party. Okay, so there are all kinds of card-carrying Baathists, communists, whatever you want to call them, who really were non-ideological people. It's just what you had to do. In that country, it was sort of like getting a driver's license. You got to go get a driver's license. You want to drive a car. Otherwise, you're illegal, and if you're illegal in a state like Iraq, you're in real trouble. The Iranian-trained special groups. Iran does not want to see a Sunni government come to power in Iraq. So they are doing, and remember that Iraq and Iran fought an 8-year war before the Gulf War in the 1980s, the Iran-Iraq War, and it was bloody and awful, and the Iranians want to dominate Iraq, and they're in there causing all kinds of trouble. They're a Shia country, so basically they support their Shia co-religionists in Iraq. And then there's criminals and corrupt officials and just all kinds of people. Iraq is awash in weapons because of all of the warfare and all of the military assistance that they've received for decades from the Soviet Union and from the United States. And so this is a bloody, chaotic place. One of their tactics is not to form into platoons, companies, battalions, regiments, brigades, and divisions and confront the United States Army and the United States Marine Corps. That is a losing proposition. They know what our strong suit is. We can do that till the cows come home. So their tactics are to cause as much trouble as they possibly can and as much violence as they possibly can without having to stand up and fight against American military units of any size, because they know they're outgunned and they're out everything, okay? So they hide in among the population. And a lot of the population tacitly supports these people. They might not support them from an emotional or ideological point of view, but they don't want to get their throats cut, and they certainly don't want to see their families' throats cut. And so if these bad guys say, you got to go along with this, for the most part, people do. So it's all these kind of things that characterize warfare in Iraq. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to create fear and despair. They are trying to generate religious conflict between the Sunnis and the Shia, because they know that that can be a mobilizing force that they can then exploit for their group, whatever it is, to become more powerful. And so it's a long-term game. Get the United States out, okay? Build your own power base, tear down your enemies, and position yourself to move into power at whatever time the government collapses and or the coalition troops move out. So that's kind of their game. One of the most important weapons that's used in the Iraq War are improvised explosive devices, or for short, IEDs. And you've all heard about IEDs. Here are samples of IEDs. What they are military explosives that you can get almost anywhere in Iraq. You can pick it up off the ground, you can buy it in a marketplace, you can go to a smuggler. It just doesn't matter. It's all over the place. You use military explosives and you come up with some field expedient, what the military calls field expedient. You make up some way to set it off. So you can put it in a Coke can and hide it in a pile of trash, fill a tailpipe of a car full of it, take some old artillery rounds or landmines and rig those for explosives. C4 plastic explosives of various kinds, very, very popular. These all look little. Some are huge, like this puppy. That's a recreation. That is a truck full of military munitions, including a 1,000-pound bomb. Now they think that that is the weapon that destroyed the UN headquarters in Baghdad in August 2003. But you can imagine the difficulty of trying to find that one truck from all the trucks that are buzzing around Baghdad or buzzing around Iraq. So, they call that a VB IED because in the military we make an acronym out of absolutely everything, so nobody will know what we're talking about. And so a VB IED is a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device. But if you say VB IED, it prevents us from having to use those other 22 syllables that are associated with the words that it stands for. So it's a shorthand. Okay, let's show this second thing because I want you to get a sense of an IED. That's the beginning of a military convoy, those vehicles right there. Okay, we can cut that. Now, that's a more powerful IED. That wasn't C4 in a Coke can, okay? But I think my own perception is that there's been sort of a tendency to look at this IED problem as sort of a, well, yeah, it's an inconvenience or it's a hazard or it's a, whatever you call it. These things are just incredibly deadly and they can kill a lot of people. One of the most grievous IED attacks that was not directed against American troops. It was directed against civilians, as a matter of fact. It was directed against Yazidis, who are a Christian minority in Iraq, and killed 800 people. So this is a very, very serious problem, and a lot of these weapons are directed against what we call soft targets or civilian targets. The other guy's mosque, the other guy's community hall, the other guy's apartment building, whatever you want to call it. Now, this is a map that I got off of this website, which is very reliable. Okay, and this is Ramadi, where the 1st Brigade was. This is Baghdad. And these are IEDs that they found along the road in 1 month, May 2004. Okay, now not all of them were detonated. We did lots of route clearance operations looking for the things. And not all of these were rigged to explode. Some of these are unexploded ordnance, which can be deadly and is something we got to police up in addition anyway. But you can imagine, we talk about an American soldier who comes home from Iraq and you say, well, what did you do, son? And he said, I was a truck driver. And in the back of your mind, you can say, okay, well, welcome home. Thanks for your service. Okay, truck driver, that's honorable, but, not the pointy end of the spear. Probably didn't have to kill everybody. Can you imagine spending 365 days in Iraq driving a truck up and down roads that are covered with IEDs like that? Can you imagine the tension of every single minute behind that wheel, looking at every pile of trash, every wrecked car, and then we wonder why something funny happens and a GI all of a sudden kind of, jumps. So JD's telling me I got 10 minutes left. I'm only up to Task Force Danger. I'll go through this quickly. This is Task Force Danger. There's the 1st Infantry Division. There's where it was. There are other divisions all over there. We'll take a closer look at it. The 1st Infantry Division, when it went there as Task Force Danger, was 20,000 troops. And I want to give you a sense of what we're trying to do with 20,000 troops. We're trying to protect all of that. 4 provinces, 3.5 million people, and on and on and on and on and on. So this is a big, tough job. I mean, a lot of challenges to this, okay? This is the division mission statement, okay? General John Batiste in the 1st Infantry Division. What's the first thing on the mission? Ensure a secure, stable, and self-reliant Iraq. Oh, yes, sir, I'll get right on that. Okay, and then there's there's other stuff, neutralize the anti-Iraqi forces and ensure successful elections. And so you start doing all of these things. And what we do is we operate out of forward operating bases. We put our troops in FOBs, forward operating bases, that were fortified and protected and outside the cities. And why do we do that? Because we don't want to be in the cities, okay? We're turning the government over to the Iraqis, remember? So we'll just be there and we'll conduct security operations as we need to into and out of the cities, but we're not going to get entangled in this thing because this is that invasion liberation period of the first phase of the war. And to make a long story short, the 1st Division successfully creates sufficient security in its area that the first internationally approved free and fair elections in the history of Iraq take place in 2005. What a wonderful thing that is. But you can see that the Sunnis, okay, hardly participated at all. They don't want to play. They don't like it. They know they're a minority. They think if they show up, they'll be outvoted. A Shia government will come to power. That's not what they're in for. And so they just boycott the polls. So you have a free and fair election in which they could have participated, but the result is that there is a big chunk of the population that is feels disenfranchised and feels left out. 2006, we had a brigade, the 2nd Brigade, as you might guess, in Iraq. But another thing we start doing out of Fort Riley, Kansas, is organizing teams of soldiers like this one here into military transition teams. These guys are going to patrol the streets of Baghdad, but what they're going to do is they're going to go to Iraq and become part of an Iraqi unit. And they're going to be the embedded advisors and assistants to that Iraqi unit in hopes of standing up the new Iraqi army, because we disbanded the old Iraqi army, and half those guys went off and joined one or other sets of the enemies because they're so ticked off about being kicked out of the army and they don't have a job and so on and so forth. Stand up this new Iraqi army, but of course it doesn't know what to do, so it gets it gets its own personal band of Americans to walk around with it and participate. And those are MIT teams. And Fort Riley for 3 years trains thousands of these people and deploys them to Iraq. While all that is going on, the only Medal of Honor recipient in Operation Iraqi Freedom, one of three Medal of Honor recipients from Operation Iraqi Freedom experiences the action for which he is later decorated. I'm sorry to say that was a posthumous decoration. He was killed in action. This is Specialist Ross McGinnis of the 1st Infantry Division. He was a 50 caliber machine gunner in the turret of an up-armored Humvee when a grenade was thrown off the roof of a building and went through the turret and into the vehicle cab. Instead of jumping out, as the drill would require him to do, he jumped in and covered it with his body, was blown to smithereens, but the other 4 soldiers in the Humvee survived. No question that this is above and beyond the call of duty. In 2006, this war is going so badly that the American public is becoming weary. And I saw this because I arrived here in DuPage County from Washington, D.C. in 2004, and I hardly ever saw a car that didn't have a yellow ribbon magnet on the back that said, "Support our troops." And those started to disappear. And you'll look high and low for one now. 2006, I'd say about 50% gone. 2008, about 75% gone. 2010, almost entirely gone. You could measure the disaffection of us, we the people, in the disappearance of that enthusiasm for the war. There are people in Washington who think we're going to lose it. They think the strategy is wrong. The administration has got it wrong. We're taking casualties for no purpose. There's no end in sight. This is going to become another quagmire. There are echoes of Vietnam, and we have to change. And what makes the administration listen to those people is that they lost the November 2006 elections. Both houses of Congress go to the Democrats. And President Bush smells the coffee. okay, and decides he needs to listen to the critics of the Secretary of Defense and the administration and, quite frankly, the military. Among those critics is this officer, General David Petraeus, who all this time, he commanded the 101st Airborne Division in the invasion of Iraq, promoted to 3 stars, but sent out to Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where he rewrites America's counterinsurgency doctrine for the Army and the Marine Corps. How do we fight guerrilla wars? And he does a really good job of it. And he is very persuasive that this way of confronting a problem like Iraq is wiser than the way we are confronting it. So what does he say? What's the difference between what Petraeus says and the way we're doing things? Well, the first is your first job is to protect the population, even if it means not finding and killing the enemy. That the population is the center of gravity, that you've got to have the people with you, and task number 1 is to provide safety for the people who live in these cities, even if it takes forces away from the job of finding and killing the enemy. You've got to live in the neighborhoods so the people know who you are. So leave the fobs that are on the outside of the city. You've got to patrol on foot so they can see your face, not in heavily armored columns that just run through a neighborhood, kind of like we saw in the video. You can't be easily provoked, and you cannot retaliate. You have to be patient. You can retaliate, but you have to be patient, and you don't retaliate from a posture of emotion and rage. Don't abuse prisoners. Now, I put Abu Ghraib up there, and the fact is the American Armed Forces treat prisoners better than just about any army in history, but we have exceptions, and we have bad things that happen because it's war. Watch out for the big construction projects. There's corruption in them, and people might not like them. You might have one sheet that says, yeah, build a highway through here, but it levels a dozen houses. Small, steady, practical improvements. Don't try to fight everybody. Figure out who the most dangerous people are, go after them, and if that means you have to make friends with somebody who is not your friend, who's your enemy, if that enemy is less dangerous than your main enemy, make peace, go after the main enemy. Targeted attacks based on intelligence versus large roundups of possible enemies. Minimal use of precise force versus massive use of force. Physically separate the sectarian communities. Okay? Build Jersey walls and barriers between the Shiite part of the neighborhood and the Sunni part of the neighborhood. Clear, hold, build. Not only clear the enemy out of a community, but hold that community after you've cleared it. And once you're satisfied that it's secure for the long run, start to create a better community to the best of your ability. And then a really big deal, simultaneous coordinated effort everywhere in the country along these lines. Many of these things were going on all over Iraq at the initiative of individual commanders, but not necessarily as part of the strategy, because the strategy was keep the American footprint light, stay out of the cities, pull back. The other thing that the critics in Washington said is, if you're going to do this, you're not going to need fewer troops, you're going to need more troops. And so we had the surge. And the secretary in 2007 is replaced. And Sink Cent is replaced. And General Casey is replaced. And guess who? Ta-da! General Petraeus, okay, becomes the 4-star commander in Iraq, so he can oversee this particular theory of how to go about things. So here is the city of Baghdad. This is Iraq. This is Baghdad. All these little triangles are called joint security stations. Those are the tiny little outposts where a squad of troops or American soldiers are living in the neighborhood with the Iraqis, okay? You can see here and here, 2 brigades of the 1st Infantry Division are in western Baghdad. The 4th Brigade was deployed as part of the surge. And you can see sort of, we're going, this is Baghdad, we're farther out, this is Baghdad, we're farther out. And in these 3 operations, what we're doing is we're clearing the enemy out of the environs of Iraq and pushing them out to the suburbs, and then pushing them out of the suburbs into the hinterlands, and then going after them with precision strike weapons in the hinterlands and trying to kill them. Okay, so that's why you need a surge. That's why you need more boots on the ground in order to conduct this kind of warfare. Was it successful? Well, yes. In December 2006, these are the, and look at how they follow the river lines. Okay, Tigris, Euphrates. These are the grounds that are either controlled or strongly influenced by Al-Qaeda in Iraq in December 2006. This is what it looks like in March 2008. And there are other maps that show you even more progression. And these are the casualties. These are security incidents of all kinds, up and 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 up, particularly through 2007, and then phew. And then let's look at American casualties. Okay, same thing. So the surge worked. There's no question about it. And we were able to stabilize Iraq. We were able to lower the level of casualties. That led to a little more political contentment here in the United States about this awful war, and it set the conditions for President Obama between 2008 and 2011 to keep his campaign promise to end the war and bring the troops home. Let's not forget that we paid a huge price for what we did in Iraq. Whether you're for it or against it, success, failure, I don't know. A lot of young Americans paid an awful lot, and this doesn't even illustrate those who came home with emotional challenges that we all need to assist with. This just gives you a chronology of what I've already said, and I'm not going to go through it because JD will get the hook out, and how terrible I'm his boss, so he can't do that, but he can, and what a scene it would be. You'd talk about it forever. I was going to talk about these slides. I won't unless somebody wants to in the Q&A session, except to say that in that 2008 to 2011, we did less fighting. The Iraqis did fighting. We did more talking. And all of these are 1st Infantry Division soldiers talking, building, protecting, creating, trying to create the conditions in Iraq in which we could go home and an Iraqi government and an Iraqi security force could take responsibility for the country. And right up to the very end, we were losing great young men like this guy. And he isn't the last 1st Division soldier to die in Iraq, but he's number 207 by our count. And he died in a non-combat incident in 2010. And that underscores another fact of military life that every veteran knows. We think of death in a military operation as in combat. An awful lot of our soldiers are killed or grievously injured performing military duties that are not combat related, as was this young man. And again, okay, with the rise of ISIS, Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into ISIS. ISIS metastasized in Raqqa, Syria. It came up with a new philosophy, the Caliphate, and expanded and took the city of Mosul. And that's when we woke up and said, boy, this is going to be a real problem. And so we're trying to figure out what's the right response to this problem. And in figuring that out, guess who's back in Iraq? The headquarters of the 1st Infantry Division and 1 Brigade, and they are aiding and abetting the Iraqi ground war against ISIS, and they are training the Iraqi army, and they are providing advice and assistance to the Iraqi Ministry of Defense. And I'm not sure when they're going to come home, but those are some of those great 1st Division soldiers. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. We got a few minutes for questions if anybody wants to entertain any. I told you everything I know, so a question is sort of pointless. But yeah.
Just one quick statement. Thank you very much, Colonel. I learned more about Iraq and what's been going on over there from you in the last hour than I have probably in the last 5 years. My son was over there. He was a company commander in Diala Province. He was over there
bless
twice.
his heart. Yeah.
He explained a lot to me, but this was absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. So
Oh,
just
you're very
appreciate
welcome.
it.
Yeah, thank you. And thank him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
okay?
Yeah.
And what happens where the Iranians are in there trying to create a relationship with those Iraqis and supporting them and fighting with the Iraqis as well? What happens when that stuff all gets together?
I don't know. Okay. And I don't have any particular.
Maybe I just hear it on the radio.
No, I think it is happening. I don't think the Iranian special groups are ever pulled out. Okay, so I think they're still in there trying to create trouble. The challenge in my mind that the Iraqi army has is less military than it is political. Okay, an army fights when it has something to fight for. And right now, Iraq is so divided among its people that the army and the security forces, despite all of our efforts to counter this, are perceived as instruments of an illegitimate minority government. Now, the recent change, because the Sunnis were excluded from the election and because Prime Minister al-Maliki for several years just started to change everything in Iraq to favor the Shia population. And so big chunks of the Iraqi population don't have trust and confidence in the security forces because the security forces don't represent the whole country. And the security forces don't have the sort of allegiance that American armed forces have to the country as a whole, to the idea of we serve the state, we serve the duly elected government, we serve the people, and that means all the people, okay? And so, you know, we can hardly say they were poorly trained. We trained them for 10 years, okay? Now we're back in there training them again, and the current prime minister has tried to change a lot since he came to power barely a year ago, right? So I don't have a real answer for you. But almost all of the pieces of the puzzle that were there at the beginning of this war that I talked about at the beginning of my talk are still there. Okay? Yeah. Yes, sir. They try real hard. They try really, really hard. But, you know, now this is a bad analogy. I want to say that. It's a bad analogy, but it's the only analogy I can come up with in our history. For the longest time, we wouldn't let black soldiers serve in the armed forces. And if you tried to put white Americans and black Americans in the same outfit, you were looking for trouble. And the Army just sort of washed their hands of that problem and said it's better to have them in segregated units because they're just going to go at each other's throats. And it took us decades to get past that. I mean, decades to get past it. Many of us here can remember it. And that problem pales in comparison to the problem of mixing Sunni and Shia in the same outfit. So we have tried it, and in some cases it's been successful. But I think, and I don't know this for sure because I don't keep up to the minute on every single thing that's going on in Iraq, but I think the American position right now is let the Iraqis figure this out, and if they think it's better to have some Shia units, some Sunni units, okay. And I think what they're trying to do is say, well, maybe a battalion would have a Shia company and a Sunni company so that, you know, you don't have them so close together that they're cutting each other's throats, but they get the idea that they got to cooperate. And so that wherever you go, there is somebody who is like the people who live in that part of the country. But it's a huge problem. How do you make a national army that serves the idea of an Iraqi state, okay, with soldiers recruited from all these different factions that for generations have disliked each other? Tough problem. Yeah, Jack.
Thanks for pointing out that J.D. Camus here was a first ID soldier in Iraq. I was hoping maybe somebody could ask him a couple questions about his deployment, his combat experience in
Go
Iraq,
ahead.
since he's here tonight, and just say, JD, I hate to put you on the spot, but could you tell us about your year in Iraq, what you did, what your mission was, what your takeaways were? And thank you, brother.
You're welcome. Thanks. I deployed in April of 2003, went in attached to the 173rd. At the time, I was the battalion commander, the tank battalion commander's gunner. So I was a sergeant, and when we went in, we only went in with 5 tanks and 5 Bradleys, which are armored infantry fighting vehicles, attached to the 173rd. But the Iraqis didn't know that, and CNN made it sound real good that a whole task force was coming, because afterwards we rounded up the commanders, and they all talked about they thought 50 tanks were coming, and they had all been in the first Gulf War, and they were like, well, that's not going to work. So they literally just took their uniforms off and went home. So as we marched south to Kirkuk, the fighting was, fairly light, because they all thought 50 tanks were coming. So there was piles of uniforms, hundreds of abandoned vehicles, armored vehicles all over the place. So this is one time when the news media really, really helped us out, and it looked good on our part. And once we got down to Kirkuk, that's where we took over. And this is where some of the things that Dr. Herbert was talking about come into effect. This is where Kurds and Sunni and Shia kind of overlap, but especially Kurds and Sunni. And Kirkuk has always been kind of disputed. Kurds say it's theirs, Sunni say it's theirs, people back and forth. So a lot of the things that we were doing was not as much like you were talking about direct combat, Omaha Beach, things like that. Lots and lots of patrols and lots of keeping things calm. People kept, there's not the same kind of laws and things that we take for granted. So someone comes up to someone's house and says, you know what, I like your house, I don't like you, I'm coming back on Friday to kill you if you're still here. And so we've got to prevent that. Because also that person can't come to us and say, I've got this deed. They maybe don't have a deed. They don't have those kinds of things. So we're doing a lot of that. And the tanks and things really helped out with that. There was a day that they were going to steal hundreds of houses, some certain faction. And so early in the morning, we just drove the tanks out before dawn, drove around the city all day, and it was quiet as a mouse. So those were the main things that we did, and it just consisted of lots and lots of patrols, lots of raids. We also started doing some of the stuff, the counterinsurgency. We would go into a small town. They don't have a school. We would give them money. They would build a school, working through these things. With the Iraqi army being disbanded, about 3 months or so into the tour, they realized this was a terrible idea. These guys are just going off to the insurgency, because in their culture, if you're a man and you do not have a job, you're basically not a man. You're, just not worth anything. So they'll go to anyone who will pay them. So we decided we had to just start paying them to stay home and do nothing. And so we had to start guarding that and organizing that. And so there's a lot of that, and it gets kind of tedious. It's over and over and over and over for a year. And that's essentially what we did in Kirkuk there. And things got nicer as you went. The Air Force showed up. They brought really good food. They took care of a lot of things. Things got better as you went. But one of the big things that you see is the switch from unit to unit. We got to know all the people in the area. The people in the area trusted us. They knew us. They would come to us. We would go. We knew exactly the certain people that we could work with. When the 25th Infantry came in, they thought, we're coming into war, and we're going, but our area wasn't exactly like that. It was much calmer. So they were really ramped up, which is understandable. They didn't know. And then they come in, they don't trust the people that we trust because they don't know them. Same vice versa. The Iraqis don't trust them because they don't know them. So a lot more attacks start happening, a lot of difficulties. And this is a thing that you then see throughout the whole war. Every year, you have this same problem. How do you do a handoff so that it's smooth and seamless and you keep things together? So that's, in a nutshell, my essential experience. If anyone's got any specific questions.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, JD. I thought that was great. And Jack, thanks for giving JD that opportunity. I'm really glad that we did. And we appreciate your service, JD, and all of our veterans. Okay, I'm going to throw the flag there because we've gone over our time and people are probably very eager to get going. Both of us will stay here if you've got any follow-on questions. Thank you for coming. And one last, and fill out your critiques of how you like this, and tell us how much more food we can bring and all that kind of stuff. And But there's a last point I'd like to make about this. This is serious stuff. This is so serious. What are we going to do about a problem like Iraq? And how do we, the United States, if we have to, how do we prosecute a long-term commitment to some other country? And there's a lot of answers to that. Some people would say, just don't go there. Well, okay, but then you accept the consequences of whatever happens there because you're not there. Okay? I don't have a solution for that. I just have this to say about it, and this is why we give these talks. It's up to us. It's up to us. We got to have an opinion. We got to think about it. We got to vote our consciences. We got to tell our representatives what we think. They need to hear from us. We got this tiny little all-volunteer force that gets sent all over the world by a Republican administration that's from, quite frankly, the right wing of the Republican Party, and now a Democratic administration is from the left wing of the Democratic Party. That army will go wherever the president tells them to go. They are loyal to the bone. They'll do what the duly elected commander-in-chief can tell them to do anything, and they'll, by God, try to do it if it's legal. Okay? So it's our job to make sure, to the best of our ability, that our voice is part of the equation and that we make wise and good choices about what these good people are risking their lives to do, because they do it in our name. And that's why we're proud of them. Okay, that's it. Thank you.